Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak upon an important subject. And as you all must have seen, that the topic itself is quite, it can be termed controversial too, because I see that the link of whatever is happening in 2019 to 2020 is because of the Chinese idea of communism, and also it somehow goes back to their whole ancient idea of perceiving the whole realm, how they have been perceiving the realm as, and somehow the whole Chinese idea of communism is very different from what the Russians were practicing. And we all have been facing the pandemic badly, and now India is in the top list in terms of the numbers. And somehow this has fractured us badly, and everything is affected, whether it's economy, infrastructure building, everything is under a kind of collapse. But why did China do this? Or rather, at times, I won't shy off to even call it as a Wuhan virus or Chinese virus, because their own mouthpiece, Global Times, has been saying Spanish flu and whatnot. So this has been a practice since long. We associate the thing with the place for its recognition that where it originated from. So here we have the Wuhan virus in front of us. But how it happened, what was the reason behind doing so, whether it is really a bioweapon or not. And at times, if I say that it's a bioweapon, then maybe that people may start calling me fringe or whatnot, because somehow this idea is not very much acceptable to people to call this COVID as the bioweapon. They say that it's just a normal virus which just happened. But if just one goes into very basic of how a coronavirus or the COVID, this virus actually has been living with us from long time. But there was a change which was made in the virus, which transformed whole of a thing. Now you see the virus, the images what you see is having the spikes. So those spikes were created by some kind of mutation, and by adding amino acid onto the virus, and then it got the spikes so that it could clung onto the bodies. It could just, so it was certainly deliberately made to affect the whole of the system. Now the again the question arises whether it was deliberate, whether that mutation was done deliberately or it just happened accidentally. But whatever it was, it is completely man-made, and it stands upon us as a catastrophe, and perhaps we are going to face it for quite a long time. And this all actually goes back to, like I said, the very basic of how China had perceived its realm, where the king was perceived to be the person who would be having whole of the power to lead the world. He would be the ruler of the whole of the world as per the Chinese concept. So, without hovering here and there much, I will just begin with a few of the illustrations and the slides which I've created for everyone to relate with what I'm going to speak about. So, with that, I will be sharing my screen. So, here it is for us, the red eclipse. I'm calling it red eclipse because it's just a name I have termed it. Because red again is associated with the communism, and we have heard the concept of the red army and whatnot, and communism always draws the relation with the red, and China also has a lot of relation with red as a color. It's one of the auspicious color for them. And we talk about the red dragon, and recently we came across very interesting cartoon, or rather a caricature or an image or illustration rather, where Ram was shown killing the dragon. So somehow we have to, I perceive that India will be the power which will become the final nail in the coffin of this whole disaster which is being brought upon by CCP upon us, the Chinese Communist Party. You can see the three images over here. The three images are very remarkable. And I always say that it's the hereditary traits which make the thing happen through your ends. Whether you, if your land, if you come from a land where art is the most prosperous thing and you have been doing it from ages, then perhaps the generation by generation will grow on to doing a lot of better arts. Like Pratisthana, which is now known as Pathan, is known for its artwork. The Ellora caves, or this image what you see over here of the Kailasha temple, is a remarkable creation. If you come to Rome, then Rome also has seen a lot of magnificent artists like Leonardo da Vinci and whatnot. We saw the works of Le Corbusier, though I'm not a very big fan of Le Corbusier in architecture, but man has really given some very remarkable work, and his whole following his footprints. A lot of people have come with great artworks, and after the Kailash temple, you can see this is the Patni sari, which again is following the trait, the hereditary trait, what I can say. And for the China, it's for me, it's the China has expansionism and in their blood, and hence it continues. Like if you can see that the illustration what I have put onto the right hand side, it will show you through animation that how they have been expanding and expanding throughout the age era and the ages. There has never been a halt. So it all initially in the 1000 BC, if you will see that it's a very small segment of land, and then they start expanding through the Zhou dynasty. So in the time of Zhou dynasty, it's quite small. Then when it comes to the varying states, then it's expanded a bit around 350 BC. Then Han dynasty comes around 100 BC, and then Sui dynasty in 680, and so it goes on and on. So it's ever expanding, and it's been more than 4,000 of years as per the written records. Chinese expansionism has been the central feature of whole of the history of East Asia. Perhaps the most prominent expansionist or the imperialist we have in whole of Asia is only China, as per the records. Since the 20th centuries, from when the Chinese strength recovered again, they were a bit slow down. After that, also they have pursued this idea of expansionism very strongly. And the illustrations, what you see on the right, I have sourced it from Albert Herman's History and Commercial Atlas of China. So, so this will give you a fair amount of idea that how China has been expanding through the ages. Now, again, if I thought that a brief idea of the historicity of how they have been expanding must be given to set the perspective very right. And so there was a phase of the varying states when the states of China, so-called China, were into the fight and the brawl. And before the king of the ancient state of Qin first unified the Chinese empire in 221 BC by conquering all the other states in what was then considered China, and proclaimed himself the first emperor and became known as Qin Shi Huang. So this is where the whole idea of expansionism per se begins, and then comes the ancient Han Dynasty, which is around 202 BC to 220 AD, and established a control over the northern Vietnam, northern Korea, and the Tarim Basin of Central Asia. Then there was a very short-lived Sui dynasty, which again comes in the 6th century AD, and they invaded the northern Vietnam, and they attacked the southern Vietnam as well, and they attempted to conquer the Korea, but they failed over there. And if one wants to get more idea about this, one can go on to the detail of reading Goguryeo Sui Wars. Then there came the Tang dynasty in the 7th century to the 10th century. They aided the Korean Silla kingdom in defeating their two Korean rivals, yet became the strong change when they discovered the Silla was not about to allow the Tang to claim much of the Goguryeo territory, as it had been under the Chinese Han dynasty's control a few centuries before, the Han having wrested it from the native kingdoms at that time. Again, the Tang dynasty established control over the Tarim Basin region as well, fighting wars with the new Tibetan Empire and stripping them of all their colonies in Central Asia, which was abandoned after the An Lushan rebellion. Then comes the Song dynasty in the 10th century and continues till the 13th century. They secured the maritime trade routes that ran from the southeastern Asia into the Indian Ocean and established fortified trade bases in the Philippines. The Mongol-led Yuan dynasty also made attempts to invade Japan, and so it's kept on going. It was never stopping. So now you can see that this is the Qing dynasty in the 19th century, that how much expanded they were. The image onto the right. This illustration I just took from Wikipedia because this was giving a fair amount of idea in the context of India and the states or the countries above. So by the late 19th century, in response to the competition with other states, the Qing government of China attempted to exert direct control of its frontier areas by conquest, or if already military control, conversion in the provinces. So they were just trying to, which were already there, they were just trying to convert them into their own provinces. And the Ming dynasty, where the Ming dynasty loyalists also existed from China, they invaded Taiwan and expelled Dutch colonialists from the island during the siege of the Fort Zeelandia and founded the Chinese kingdom of Tonkin. The Ming loyalists quickly moved to replace the institutions and culture of Dutch colonial rule with Han Chinese colonial rule. Language and religious institutions left by the Dutch were closed and replaced by the Confucian temples and the Chinese language schools for both Han Chinese and the Aboriginals. Officials also encouraged new immigration of Han Chinese from China into the territory further inland, turning Aboriginal lands into the new farmland. After fighting between the Ming loyalists and the king, during the revolt of the three feudatories, the Qing attacked the kingdom of Tonkin. The Qing won the Battle of Pegu, and the Ming loyalists did submit to the Qing rule. Tonkin was annexed as a part of Fujian province. The Qing was convinced of Taiwan's value, and still we see that China is still stuck around with Taiwan. There are a lot of reasons for it, for them to stuck around it. So Qing were convinced of Taiwan's value to the empire due to the threat the island posed if used as a base of rival powers. They have always feared that it will be used as a base for the rival powers because Taiwan is always full of a lot of resources. The king turned Taiwan into its own province in 1885. So then and you can see the proximity of how it sits with the Tibet, and this is known to everyone most of the time, but just for a basic understanding. After British troops invaded Tibet in the waning days, or the ending days of the Qing dynasty, the king sent Zhao Effect to further integrate Tibet into China. Zhao became the successful in abolishing the powers of the Tibetan local leaders in Kham and appointing the Chinese magistrates in their places by 1910. So, though the things were not directly under the Chinese control, but they had appointed their own magistrates in the place by 1910. Qing forces were also sent to Yusang in 1910 to establish a direct control over Tibet through a province, though a province was never established in that area. Again, they were just trying to control it by the government means, but it was not completely under their control. The ability of Qing China to project power into Central Asia came about because of two changes. One, there were majorly two changes which happened over there. One was the social change, and the other was technological change. Social change was about it happened when China came under the control of the Manchus, who organized their military forces around the cavalry, which more suited for power projection than traditional Chinese infantry. So it was more of the portrayal, propaganda, and trying to show that army is much more powerful than what it is, and they relied very much around the cavalry. Also, there was a technological shift. Technological change was advance in artillery, which negated the military advantage that the people of steppe, as in the people above in the hillocks, had with their cavalry. Jungar Khanate was the last great independent nomadic power on the steppe in the Central Asia. The Zungars were deliberately exterminated in a brutal campaign during the Zungar genocide by the Manchu Bannerman and the Khalqa Mongols. It has been estimated that more than 1 million people were slaughtered, and it took generations for it to recover. Interestingly, this is an interesting point that Manchu ruling family was supporter of Tibetan Buddhism, and so many of the ruling groups were linked to the religion. Now, this is quite interesting. The Qing campaign against Burma, that is Myanmar, happened in between 1765 to 70, was its most disastrous and one of the most expensive frontier war. It though ended in a defeat, but the Qing rulers could not accept Burma as an equal. They always had this complex because, as I stated initially, that China always believed that the ruler of the China is going to rule the world. So it was quite unexpected for them. So they said that Burma is not equal. And when diplomatic relations were resumed in 1719, the Qing court considered it as a restoration of Chinese suzerainty. So that's how they have been doing for many states. I'll go further there to explain the whole phenomenon too. Major, what you can say, the wing added to the whole idea of Chinese expansionism was with the arrival of PRC, People's Republic of China, and annexation of Tibet. So annexation of Tibet by People's Republic of China and Chinese invasion of Tibet, by which the PRC gained whole control of the Tibet. These regions came under the control of China after attempts by the government of Tibet to gain the international recognition, efforts to modernize its military negotiations between government of Tibet and the PRC, a military conflict in the Chamdo area of the Western Kham in October 1950, and the eventual acceptance of the 17-point agreement by the government of Tibet under Chinese pressure in October 1951. So there's a very popular opinion from the left side that it was more of a mutual and peaceful liberation. But all the major opinions and analysis who deal with the defense, they do say that the incorporation of Tibet into China is completely an annexation. It cannot be termed as a peaceful, liberal merger or something like that. The government of Tibet remained in place and under the authority of China until 1959. Tibet uprising, when Dalai Lama was forced to flee into exile in India. A lot had happened that time. It has a lot of relations with Pandit Nehru too. And after which, the government of Tibet and the Tibetan social structures were dissolved completely. So, what is very interesting is that though China has been practicing their ancient idea of annexing and expanding and the things like that, they carry the flag of the communism, which kind of denounces the idea of tradition, but they have picked it very strongly because this is helping them to carry forward the red flag more actively and more strongly. So rather the kind of dictatorship what Karl Marx wanted to establish gets very well supported by this ancient Chinese idea. We all talk about the fingers, five fingers of the Tibet, and the concept was actually laid by Mao Zedong when he said that I have quoted one of the statement of Mao, and you can see that the illustrations below, which show the five fingers. And he had stated, I am reading it out, after having inflicted military defeats in China, the imperialistic countries forcibly took from her a large number of states tributary to China, as well as a part of her own territory. Japan appropriated Korea, Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands, the Piscators, the Port Arthur. England took Burma, Bhutan, Nepal, and Hong Kong. France seized Annam. Even a miserable little country like Portugal took Macau from us. At the same time that they took away part of their territory, the imperialists obliged China to pay enormous indemnities. Thus, heavy blows were struck against the vast feudal empire of China. So, this is what Mao Zedong says in 1939. Isn't it interesting? Because the communists talk about the internationalism, where they want to tie whole of a land in one chain, or rather one link, which is the link of the communism and the socialism. But Mao Zedong is talking something completely contrast to that idea. Or, but in my opinion, it was this idea of Mao Zedong that communism still flourished. The flag of the communism still flourished in a land, though it started seizing everywhere. It didn't exist. USSR had to collapse because they didn't give value to their ethnicity and the ethnic values. So, to tell you more about the five fingers of Tibet. So, the five fingers of Tibet, is the Chinese foreign policy conceived by Mao Zedong. And the illustration, what you see over here, it talks about the five fingers they're talking about, where the Tibet is considered to be the right hand palm, with five fingers on the periphery, the Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and the Arunachal Pradesh. And that it is China's responsibility to liberate this region is what Mao Zedong has conceived, and this is how the whole construct was set. Though was never discussed in the Chinese official public statements, it was never put across an official public statement, but the external concerns have been raised over it, possible continued existence or the revival. And this is an interesting point that what I have highlighted in yellow. Imperial China claims suzerainty over Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan as an extension of its claim over Tibet. These claims were asserted by the Chinese imperial resident in Tibet in 1908 for the first time, who wrote to the Nepalese authorities that Nepal and Tibet, being united like brothers under the auspices of the China, should work in harmony for mutual good. He suggested the blending of the five colors representing China, Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan as a part of a program to assert the Chinese claim to the face of British opposition. So this again, you can see that how China had set the whole propaganda that they were propaganding and propagating it against the face of the British, but their intent was very clear. They were looking to annex the five fingers, is what they say, is from the palm of the right hand palm of China, that is Tibet. So furthermore, points about the five finger aspects. In 1954, Chinese officials in Tibet claimed that they would liberate Sikkim, Bhutan, Ladakh, and Nepal, this Arunachal, which were wrongfully being held by the Indian imperialists. So this speaks aloud that a land which never imposed any kind of imperial attitude over any land is being called upon as an imperialist. It's happening in 1954, and a lot of warnings were coming. A lot of things were happening around the Aksai plains, and eventually it was a blunder set by Pandit Nehru that time. No heed was given, and we lost Aksai at the starting point. So, in the same year, that is in 1954, the Chinese government published a book that was called A Brief History of Modern China for the school students, which included a map that showed the territories allegedly taken by imperialistic powers between 1840 and 1919, terming them as portions of China that must be reclaimed. And India was also, because it was the British India at that time, but despite that, it was stated that India had taken the land like Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan. This map included, as I stated earlier, Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, and the entire Northeast India. This has been noted in the memoirs of Indian diplomat Triloki Nath Kaul. This book gives a lot of insight about what was happening around there. He served Peking, that now it's known as Beijing. Scholar B.S.K. Grover said that this map was a serious reflection of Peking's ambitions and not mere propaganda or idle boasting. So indeed, that was the warning which was reflected. He said that it's serious reflections of Peking ambition. So what was that ambition? What we saw recently in Galwan was nothing but the implication of the five fingers theory. The claims over the five fingers were asserted emphatically and frequently from 1958 to 61 over the Peking and Lhasa radio systems. During the mass meetings in Lhasa in July 1959, this is very interesting, we all should note, Chinese Lieutenant General Zhang Guo said, Bhutanese, Sikkimese and Ladakhis from united family in Tibet, they have always been subject to Tibet and to great motherland China. They must once again be united and taught the communist doctrine. Now, isn't it a bit hypocritical and interesting too that they must once again be united and taught the communist doctrine? Because the communist doctrine comes from a foreign land. It's not native of China. It's not what motherland China should be worried about. But this is how the propaganda was pushed across. So why still Xi Jinping works with the idea of the ancient idea of Chinese expansionism? Because it adds the feathers, it adds more weapon, more ways to really perceive, make sure that the in a way he had defined the world revolution completely differently, because Mao's communism, it differs from the Marxist communism to a great extent. Marx had rejected the idea of ethnicity and the things like that, based on which Russia worked for some time. But China, on the other hand, has modified the Marxism and Leninism to great extent in many places. Again, coming back to the Five Fingers of Tibet, it was in 2017, after the India-China border standoff at Doklam, an article in Kunzong, which is a mouthpiece magazine of CCP's Jingzhou Provincial Party Standing Committee, invoked the Five Fingers construct. And in the right hand side, I have put the snippet from the very article itself. It was published on the 26th of September 2017. It was written by Liu Litao, a scholar from Nanjing University. He alleged that India's covert support to Tibetan independence movement stems from the Tibet's cultural and economic importance in the region, and that despite the fact that India has taken away the five fingers, this is very interesting, despite the fact that India has taken away the five fingers, it is impossible to fully control the region without the palm because of the Tibetan culture's centripetal force on the five fingers. This article added that China's investments, trade, and economic relations with these Chinese regions increase. The Chinese influence in these regions will overtake that of India and will eliminate it to a great extent. And he has also, if you go through the article carefully, the very statement is again quite pointing that India has got rid of the long-term Hindu low-speed growth, embarked on the road of rapid development, and has become one of the main engines of the world economic growth. So the people of China have been very clear from long. It's one can say that the time PRC was established, they were very clear that they are going to work on the idea of expansionism, and whatever is the eyesores must be removed, whether it's initially India was not much of a problem to them, so they dealt with it only with the military terms in the initial period. What happened in 1960s, 1950s to 1960s, but later on, when India started growing, the things changed in India after Lal Bahadur Shastri took over as the Prime Minister. So India's militarization policy changed a lot. We changed a lot in terms of economy, because though we say that most of the economic changes came in during the time of PV Narasimha Rao, but Lal Bahadur Shastri had laid the foundation for how to go ahead. Though we struggled a bit in the middle with the phase which has been spoken about as a Hindu low speed growth, but India had changed a lot, and so thereon they started working on various ideas that how to uh, beat or be very competitive against the neighbor countries, and India was one of the biggest threat to them. So moving forward, and their expansion trends, one can observe. One whoever follows the geopolitics would be knowing that East China Sea disputes are something very critical, and with it all started with the 1978 Chinese economic reform, which was launched by Deng. Then China has increased its political stance, its influence, and its power abroad. Though at one side, China remains deeply neutral and not involving itself in any conflict. And the land border, as I said, now they are working in a very different way. China has increased its influence while using military and economic wealth and claims to island territories that have caused anxiety in the neighbors to the east, such as Philippines and Japan. Then South China Sea disputes are also again there. The South China Sea disputes involve both island and maritime claims of China over several neighboring sovereign states in the region, which includes Brunei, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, the Vietnam. The disputes are over islands, reefs, banks, and all the features of the South China Sea, including the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Land, the Scarborough Shoal, the boundaries in the Gulf of the Tonkin, and the waters near the Indonesian Natuna Islands. Then the third initiative, what they take is called Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm quoting Jeffrey Reeves. He said in 2018, and he argued that since 2012, Xi Jinping has demonstrated a concentrated imperialist policy towards its developing neighbor states to the south and west, especially Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Chinese overseas populations are also set to play a disproportionate role in Southeast Asian economies and what is referred to as the bamboo network. So now this is the idea which I was talking about, the ancient Chinese idea, which is called Zhangxia. And as you can see, one may think that this indication is very much similar to our Vedic idea of perceiving how the world is distributed into the realms. But here something is fishy and something very different, where it talks about the emperor being the superior and it is the center, and around him whole of a thing exists. And he has got the whole right, he's got the mandate from the heaven to rule the world. So Zangya is a Chinese term for an ancient Chinese cultural concept that denoted either the entire geographical world or the metaphysical realm of the mortals, and later became associated with political sovereignty. In ancient China, Sanya denoted the land, space, and area divinely appointed by to the emperor by universal and well-defined principles of order. The center of this land was directly apportioned to the imperial court, forming the center of the worldview that centered on the imperial court and went concentrically outward to the major and minor officials, and then became common citizens, tributary states, and finally ending with the French barbarians. So in the outer side, they have with barbarians. The center of this worldview was not exclusively in the nature, and other groups such as the ethnic minorities and the foreign people who accepted the mandate of the Chinese emperor were themselves received and included into the Chinese Xianhua. In this classical Chinese political thought, the Son of Heaven, the Emperor of China, mandate of heaven world, mandate of heaven would nominally be the ruler of entire world, although in practice there would be areas of the known world which were not under the control of the emperor. In Chinese political theory, the rulers of those areas derive their power from the emperor. So emperor becomes the core. So who is the emperor right now? It's Xi Jinping, and if he's working with this principle, then he certainly would be trying to annex as much as possible if that ancient cult or the idea is still embedded into their mind. And somehow it supports the idea of communism very strongly, which I will discuss later. I don't know how many people know, but China has been mentioned as Sina people, and along with the Kirats in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and they were considered as militias too. And somewhere the people who had rejected, but somewhere off the Vedic principle, they became the militias of those who were outside the realm of the Aryavat. So they were the ones. So though we can say that somehow this idea is coming from our realm, that how we see our lokas and how they're distributed, but they have followed a completely evil concept altogether, where the emperor becomes the central force who is going to rule whole of a world. So needless to say that though the inspiration might must have been from the Vedic idea, but they corrupted it to a large extent, and they look for a purpose where how the central force should govern or lead. Like when we talk about the asuras in our scriptures, they also had this idea of conquering whole of the world, and they would be the sole emperor of whole of a thing. Such was not the case with the Aryas. So somehow I do believe that though inspiration of this realm came from the Indian system or the Bharatiya system of the low caste, but it deflected the path and it followed something which was not Vedic, that is, the ruler or the emperor will govern the world. Now, this would be the last slide by which I will try to show something, and then I'll speak more about that how WHO messed up with whole of a thing of COVID and how communist took ahead with the idea of COVID, etc., etc. So here the slide shows a few points for how Yanxia and communism work hand in hand, because a People's Republic of China was established by Mao Zedong with the sole purpose to reinforce communism as an idea. That was the whole reason for which communism came in. People Republic of China was established. Interestingly, if one reads the doctrine of the last prophet, I call him the last prophet, Karl Marx, it will become very evident that those who follow him see others as sinners. Any cult that comes with an idea of superiority complex does ultimately believes in establishing an empire by hook or by crook. And that is all what communism is about. The idea of communism lies with the fact, with an understanding that anyone who is not following communism is a sinner. It's no different than a religion or a cult set up by a certain person, because though they want to throw away the tradition, but they stick to the tradition spoken by the last prophet, that is Karl Marx. Somehow, Mao modified it to a great extent. That's why they never collapsed, and still the China is continuing. So you can see a thing noted in the red italics. It's it's the German thing, and it says a proletarian alar Lander was the very common. It was a very common cry of the second half of the 19th century. The German phrase, which literally means "proletarians of all countries unite." To make things even more clearer, below is the final translated paragraph from the. This is a final paragraph from the Communist Manifesto, which says that the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So this kind of gives you the whole crux of how the communists are supposed to work. And what Mao did is that he brought in the ethnic ideas into the communism or the Marxism and Leninism. He tried to connect it with his own ancient practice of annexing the lands and somehow connected the people. I always say one thing that if at all any political party wants to succeed in India, they will first need to hold the flag of nationalism, and that's very true. That nationalism or patriotism is something which can bind all the people together. And doing so, you can even practice the things like communism. It gives you, if remains unnoticed from people that it's not a right practice and whatnot. So Chinese people fell in the trap of the Mao, where communism, they understood that the communism is going to work out for them, and also he had his own very forcible methods to get the things done. But he spoke about the nationalism, and he spoke about the patriotism among the people, and that is what somehow set the record or set the train very in the very right direction for the Chinese communism, or the Mao thought, or the Maoism. That is how we call it in India or in the other parts of the world. So now I will take you a bit through how the pandemic thing, how COVID became a very instrumental tool for them, and how it was mismanaged by WHO completely, and how WHO actually played a role or a part of communist propaganda completely. And so To start off with, I'll just try to recap what I said so far. The first thing what I covered is that China always believes in the idea of expansionism. Their whole intent to um, conquer the world around comes from a very ancient idea of taxonomy, and also they also draw a lot of inspiration from the communist idea, which talks about spreading throughout the world. So they use their ancient idea in collaboration with the communism to spread the idea of communism in the best possible way. So to speak more about it, I'm not sure that how many people really believe that WHO has messed up with the things or has played as a puppet in the hands of Communist Party of China. But my analysis or my understanding really makes me believe so. So recently in Ladakh, the Prime Minister had said that the age of expansionism is over and this is the era of development. And when Prime Minister said this meant a lot. The very statement of Prime Minister was indicating definitely about China and the main problem what lies with the China. We have finished eating more than half of the pudding that has been served in the 20th year of the 21st century. But yet we see that a big challenge is kissing the 21st year, and we don't know that whether we are going to end up safe and sound. And the least we have done at stretch in this year is only to discuss about a deadly pandemic. But of all, what has kept people occupied and thinking is was actually the cause of the demon called COVID. What was the cause of the demon called COVID? Every one of us is thinking about it. Should we be shy to call it, as I mentioned earlier, should we be shy to call it a Chinese virus or Wuhan virus like Spanish flu, like how Global Times says it? Certainly not. We must call it out because this is the game of the China and more of a bio weapon, which I have, per my analysis, it's a bio weapon, which they have put upon us as a tool to execute their malicious idea. Away from the truth with the motive to disguise, various papers have been written, analysis done, and reports made about the origin of the pandemic. There have been phases when even to mention it as bioweapon has been considered fringe. Like I said, it would have been still cooler had it only been about the pandemic. But the prodigies of the Mao have been tickling around the world at various fronts, like all the borders you see that they have been messing around everywhere. The losses that we have bore globally is massive, and the issue is certainly complex. And I have already addressed about the expansionist idea of the China and how Marx had also written about the expansion, or rather, reach out to throughout the world. Now, if communists indeed have to work on an agenda to win the world. That is a general way for ahead for the communists. No one can deny the fact that formation of People's Republic of China under the leadership of Mao happened to fulfill the idea of world revolution on October 1, 1949. This is when PRC came into being. When this happened, its large sized neighbors were not. The idea had beyond the borders. The other end Marxist Leninist, though Mao changed the principle in the future, had to expand in order to spread. Because if you want to spread communism, if you don't spread, then it will. If you don't spread your territories, you can't take it forward because the neighboring countries are not following that principle. Mao had set his own principles, which came to be popularly known as Maoism, as I mentioned. And Mao was very clear that Aksai Plain was route to Tibet and vulnerable northeastern edges of India. While Mao established PRC, he ensured to keep it different from the way Stalin was had been shaping the CPSU, because CPSU worked on a very different principle and they were not more about ethnicity. Ethnicity was given importance by Mao in order to ensure that communism redefined as cult Maoism, which came to be considered as the Chinese pride. At the same time, Mao had become a strong international personality. In words of American journalist Miss Anna Losey Strong, she used to do a propaganda for Mao, and she has written extensively about him. Mao's intellectual achievement Mao's intellectual achievement was to change the Marxism from an European form to an Asiatic form, in ways in which neither Marx nor Lenin could dream. While Soviet was turning softer with alignment towards America to an extent, China was clear of its stand. So, if one refers to further the Chinese Communist Party's proposal concerning the general line of International Communist Movement, published by PRC in 1963, that also speaks about the world revolution and the expansion. So, if I quote just one paragraph out of it, in the course of revolutionary struggles of oppressed nations and peoples, the proletarian party must put forward a program of its own which is thoroughly against imperialism and domestic reaction and for national independence and people's democracy. And it must work independently among the masses, constantly expand the progressive forces, win over the middle forces, and isolate the reactionary forces. Only thus can it carry the national democratic revolution through to the end and guide the revolution on the road of socialism. So they the Maos also said the things very clear that they were all in for the expansion and they were very clear for spreading the communism. Mao always wanted to expand in order to spread the empire he had established, and the proletarian support was quite obvious to him, for he was representing himself as a guardian angel of all. Under Mao, PRC was playing the game much better than Soviet. Mao had set plans perfectly to sell his product of communism, and amid his naval states, he was just because he get related with the ethnicity. He was always talking about the brothers and sisters of China. He was always talking about the Chinese motherland, the states which needed development and were vulnerable because of the recent colonial exit. They just fell prey to him, prey to his ideas. He was a game and he had the game. He was both of them. Perhaps CCP became the second party after Nazis to spread propaganda the right way. The use of the old maps remained one such propaganda. They have been, like I spoke about, one textbook which published the old maps and tried to include the parts of India and many other neighboring places, like they had included Nepal, Indian Ladakh, and Arunachal Pradesh. So they have been very good at propaganda, and maps have been their one crucial tool to do so. It was just a if one needs to understand, so it basically gives a crux of why China believes in expansionism. Though the subject is so intense that one can eventually end up writing a whole book on the whole expansionist idea of China and how communism it supports communism. Now, let me bring you back a bit in the current time. We have we all have observed the chameleon. I call it chameleon, which unfortunately is deemed to be responsible for the health of the world. They have been very famous saying that who cares? WHO cares, but who cares? So WHO has turned into a chameleon, and for the sake of Lord Mao, why it won't have happened when the puppet whom CCP nurtured in the gorgeous Africa created a history by becoming the first ever non-medical doctor to lead WHO. The virus that emerges in the same land, the press of which calls out it pandemics by Spanish flu and more, feels agitated when we all are calling it Wuhan virus, isn't it? The gift of CCP, the famously we all call it COVID, was already in operation, and WHO had to be the medium to help it reach the destinations because they control the health completely. And I'm not saying this, don't say that, but this is a complete analysis and collaboration of facts what I have done make me believe that WHO was chosen as the the medium to spread the COVID. So, but did you ever wonder that why this exception happened and a non-medical doctor became Director General of WHO? Then you need to really skim through the if you refer to the newspapers of around 4 years back or so when Dr. Tedros was showing it obedience towards CCP, That time he was in the government of Ethiopia, and if one starts looking into his old social media posts, like in one of the social media posts, he had appreciated China, saying that under the Go Global program of China, we expect increased Chinese investment flow to Ethiopia. The 8 industrial parks identified throughout Ethiopia, some already under construction, which facilitate the migration of Chinese companies to Ethiopia. So he was working as a bridge between Ethiopia and China. And Tedros had won the election of DG against a very well qualified candidate, despite widely covered acquisitions that he had covered up 3 times cholera epidemics as a health minister in Ethiopia. So you can understand that he has expertise in covering up the pandemics. He has already done it thrice for cholera in Ethiopia. Now, what happened in October 18, 2017 is very interesting. Dr. Tedros announced that he had chosen dictator president Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, who is known for his human rights violations, to serve as a WHO Goodwill Ambassador. But on 23 October 2017, he had to back off the decision after there was a complete international outcry, because everyone is aware about what Robert Mugabe was about. So there were a lot of things happened, and within a week's time, he had to change his decision, or rather 5 days' time. The allegations were very serious, and somehow Dr. Tedros was unable to explain that why he has chosen Mugabe. And then I came across a detailed report done by Rebecca Mears of the Times. So she reported on October 22, 2017, where she said that diplomats said Mugabe's appointment was a political payoff from Dr. Tedros to China, a long-term ally of Mugabe, and the 50 or so African states that helped to secure Tedros' elections earlier this year. This was a big time revelation. She further mentioned that Chinese diplomats had campaigned hard for the Ethiopian, using Beijing's financial clout and opaque aid budget to build support for him among the developing countries. Further, again from the Times, the Frida Geddes had noted in the Washington Post. I came across a post in Washington Post, which was on the October 26, 2017. She writes, China worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help Tedros defeat UK candidate Dr. David Navarro. This is the person I was talking about. He is an expert of medical sciences, but still Dr. Tedros, the non-doctor, becomes the first WHO DG. Tedros' victory was also a victory for Beijing, whose leader Xi had made public his goal of flexing China's muscle in the world. It was very evident, and I'm sure that what I stated above would make it very clear that how China was certainly supporting Dr. Tedros, but now let me tell you that from 2020 how Tedros started paying back, or how he started uh, letting the COVID transport from here and there. On February 2nd, 2020, WHO chief Dr. Tedros had urged countries not to close borders to foreigners from China. Why? Was he wanting the pandemic to spread in mass? By then, China already had more than 20,000 cases. They had 20,000 plus cases by then. China's influence in WHO is also very clearly visible in the organizational treatment of Taiwan. So, if you follow the news of what happened around the Taiwan, it also speaks about how China was dealing with the things. Because since the time when China acceded to UN in 1971, it has periodically blocked Taiwan's WHO membership on the grounds that the democratically governed island is part of China from 2009 to 16. So if it is part of China, it cannot separately become a part of WHO. From 2009 to 16, China allowed Taiwan to join as a World Health Assembly as an observer under the name Chinese Taipei. After the election of President Xi Jinping in 2016, cross-strait relations chilled, causing China to block Taiwan's future participation completely. And then I cannot also miss to tell you this very interesting thing. Important state of WHO. which I believe the whole scenario largely. It was on January 14, 2020, when WHO passed on the message through tweets and Facebook. The Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human to human transmission of the novel coronavirus, which I fondly call the Wuhan virus, identified in Wuhan, China. Though Taiwan had warned of the same to the former on December 31, 2019. So, despite the information of explanation done by Taiwan 2 months earlier, WHO chooses to say that this is not the case, it's not transmittable. So, if I have to put it precisely, Taiwan had warned of human to human transmission of the Wuhan virus, but WHO concluded negatively post 2 weeks. So, what does this imply? It doesn't it imply that WHO become part of the conspiracy to spread the virus? Because if WHO really cannot find or establish that it was to be spread from human to human, then who cares what WHO is for? In my perspective, Taiwan's exclusion has a very real and dangerous consequences. One, WHO is an indispensable source of information for countries' health departments. Without a membership, Taiwan relies on China's health department for outbreak of information with delays and errors. So, WHO's inclusion of Taiwan as a part of China's territory overstates the scale of the outbreak of the island, leading to unmerited economic and diplomatic consequences. Mainland cases of COVID 2019 are now above 83,622, which with the number what the number states. Though I am sure that the number would be even more, with 4,634 dates, because that's Taiwan has right now 470 so far. And if you trust me, if you have to trust my research, what I'm doing on the subject, China is indeed hiding the numbers. This someday I like to even speak about how the China had censored the whole of the thing about the COVID in their land or country. However, multiple countries, including Italy, Mongolia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, use the WHO country classification as justification to restrict the travel from Taiwan. Did Taiwan deserve it? Because the cases were quite lesser and the things were not so bad as it was in China, but because it was a part of China, so trade things were getting affected from Taiwan. So the Philippines and Vietnam eventually reserved their travel bans on Taiwan. The island nations continued exclusion from the WHO. So while China wants to exploit as I mentioned earlier also, that they were very particular about the resources of Taiwan. Here again, while China wants to exploit the resources of Taiwan, it minimizes any possibility of its development and betterment. Now, let me again take you back to the WHO actions. Dr. Tedros' inaction stands in staking contrast to the WHO actions during 2003 SARS outbreak in China. I'm giving you one case that how contradictorily they had behaved in 2003, 17 years back. Then WHO DG was the real doctor, not the fake doctor like Dr. Tedros. He's actually a PhD doctor, not a medical doctor. Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland declared the WHO's first travel advisory in 55 years, which recommended against travel to and from the disease epicenter in the southern China. And here, Dr. Tedros urges not to close border to the foreigners from China on February 2, 2020, and it had been more than 3 months by then. The first in 2003, the travel advisory came in 55 days with a complete ban, and here a travel advisory didn't come, and it was said that no ban should be put and no border should be closed and sealed. Later on, Dr. Brundtland had also criticized China for threatening global health by attempting to cover up the outbreak through its usual playbook of arresting whistleblowers. In 2003 also, they had arrested the whistleblowers and censoring media. It happened in 2003. So only ignorant would believe on WHO and China that similar things are not happening in China right now. Because if it happened in 2003 and Dr. Tedros is expert of covering up pandemic, if you open up the news and see that how he covered the 3 pandemic, street cholera, then you will get all about this fake Dr. Tedros. In contrast, Dr. Tedros came out, though the Dr. Brundtland had criticized China. In contrast, Dr. Tedros came out as an advocate for Chinese government's COVID 2000. He appreciated the Chinese government's 2000 COVID-19 response. On January 28, he met Xi Jinping in Beijing and commended China for setting a new standard for outbreak and control. These are the words of Tedros, setting a new standard for outbreak control, and praised the country's top leadership for its openness to sharing information. Isn't it getting so? Interestingly, Dr. Tedros does not talk of how people were being arrested, spread for spreading news about disease, while online censors control the flow of information. There is a lot of online censoring going on in China about the flow of the information even now. Dr. Tedros multiplied his praise for China, stating that China has bought the world time. Time for what? To spread it? I don't know. The casualty number had really gone up by then when all these were happening. In return, Chinese propaganda machines and press didn't miss any chance to publicize how Dr. Tedros praised China and criticize the rest of the world. That if while whole of our world is unable to counter the spread, China has done it so beautifully and so perfectly. So it is really a concern that Dr. Tedros delayed in declaring COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern, which we call it PHEIC. You, if you read this, but it is a fact that it might surprise you if you come across this or read it somewhere. But in January 23, the WHO emergency committee was divided on whether to declare it as a PHEIC or not. And by January 23, a lot of things had devastated in China and it had started spreading. And it was in that week itself when it spread across into various countries, including USA, India, and everywhere. So, but though they had admitted that this will be an emergency in China, where the virus, so it makes me think that where the virus host numbers not enough as per Xi Jinping's desire or what he wanted them to, spread as much as possible so that the world doesn't start acting. A week later, Dr. Tedros declared the PHIC just a week after that. Perhaps then the desired number by the Jai were achieved and the gift of CCP was planted in every desired corner. Contrasting to Dr. Tedros, John McKenzie, who is also a WHO executive, he came out publicly and stated that international action would have been different if not for China's reprehensible obfuscation of the outbreak's extent. So, if we look at all these incidences and relate the dots very clearly, then we will find that WHO was completely playing as a puppet in the hands of China, and they let the virus spread strong enough, and it could reach the destination because of the failures of WHO to a great extent. So I think that for today I will keep it a hold for this part over here because there's a lot more to talk. But I think that it will be a bit more stretched if I may go over and above also because further I want to discuss about the bioweapons and the things like that, how it is. So maybe perhaps that should be covered somewhere else in the next talk with more graphics and the things like that.
I'll start off with a question. I was watching Palki Sharma Upadhyay's the WION anchor, her interview with Mahathir Mohamad just day before evening. Very, very good interview. And she was trying to corner him on China's expansionist strategies. But Mahathir Mohamad went on saying that the Europeans came to that region in 1509 and they were the colonialists. But China never colonized us, which is Malaysia. So he says they are different. They are they are not colonialist, and so he didn't want to comment. Do you have an observation here, or anything to comment?
Yeah. Yeah, because see, China has been China is very clear with their propaganda, the way they work, and they have stated from very beginning the territories what they feel that can remain loyal to them, they will not, go and just colonize it in any way. They tried to colonize Nepal in the best possible way. Like they have spoken very strongly about the five fingers all the time, five fingers of Tibet. So their focus has majorly been on the five fingers because these are the most vulnerable places for for China, from the China's perspective. These are the one which they need to take care of because India becomes a very strong neighbor around. But on the contrast, when it comes to Malaysia, is nothing to do with they can agree with the align with the Chinese idea. And you can if you also observe that how China had been also supporting and has been supporting Pakistan on a great extent, though they never try to do what they try to do with Nepal. The way they tried to open up the border conflict even with Bhutan, they never did it with Pakistan because they work on a very and somehow this flows in the alignment with I don't know whether I should bring it over here or not, but I do. I should put it. I think that the concept of al-taqiyya, which exists in the Islamist philosophy also, that if the things are for a larger good, then just collaborate with the people, the person, and then later on you can put across your larger motive or what you want to do, the expansion or the things like expansion is a more of a expansion can be physical, expansion can be in terms of economy, expansion can be very political in nature. Expansion is more about the control over the country. Though China has not gone into Pakistan, but it has control over Pakistan. So that also is a kind of colonization.
Well, it was a wonderful presentation
Thank
and
you.
a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I think you have really put things in perspective so far as expansionism of China is concerned, and also that how WHO has been playing with the lives of millions of people. I have one comment and one place where I disagree with you. Okay, the comment is this. We know that China has been expanding, and the expansionism of China has been very well brought out by you. But if you even a cursory glance of history will tell you that expansionism has been the rule mark and hallmark of very many empires. You have the case of the Europeans who went in for expansionism when they were strong. And
Yes.
you can take the case of Russia, which expanded all over Asia when it could, under the Tsars or under Stalin. Or you can take the case of Islam, for instance, where it spread, where Islam divided the whole entire humanity into two, believers, non-believers. And the believers could go and occupy lands of the Kafirs anytime, anywhere. And the way they expanded all over North Africa and into Europe, in Spain. And even today, the ISIS has the same philosophy of expansion. But I have a God-given right. So this philosophy of God-given right has always been there. And right now, China is strong, powerful, and they are doing this. Now, China is not unique in this. Only that we have got to stop it, and we have to find out ways to stop it.
Right.
Second point, which I wish to, where I differ with you was, I don't know why you brought in caste and our Vedic principles into China's mind. Actually, I think they have gone more into Islamic view.
Okay.
Expansions. Okay, that detracted from your complete, beautiful, presentation. I would say this. Thank you.
Yeah. So first I will speak about the second point and then I will elaborate on the first point. So the second point is that China is a very peculiar country and a very peculiar communist land. And It contradicts from a very normal communist countries, like how it is very different from how Russia behaved. And also what it always takes pride in it is the way they have carried forward the culture. They always talk about it, though the culture banishment happened largely in China too. There is no more what actually used to happen in the ancient China doesn't exist anymore. But when I put across the concept of the realm for them, this realm is existing from very long period, long before even, because Islam was not even conceived, and long before even when the Abrahamic faiths were there in place. It is perhaps goes back to the 1700 century BC and all. So that is when they were talking about the realm. So the Chinese people are very smart enough. They have been very critical of Islam in their own land. Perhaps they have suppressed the Muslims the most, and in fact all the communists. In fact, Russians had also suppressed Muslims a lot. They are doing the same thing. But what they do is that they pick from wherever it benefits to the idea of expansionism, or rather to bring across the world revolution and penetrate it into the parts of each and every land, each and every country for that matter. Now they have picked this whole ancient idea of Taxnia, which talks about the things divided into a realm. And if we relate it, all the ancient civilizations, and I do consider that all the ancient civilizations did had a connection with the Sanatan Dharma, or the Hindu way of living. So what it was about, like if I refer to Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they also talk about the China Pradesh, and they are categorized under as the Malechas, who are living towards the Himalayas. So because and all the dates which are put on record right now are so corrupted, so that when they say that this Taxiya would have happened around 1700 BC, I have a conviction that this would have been existing from the period of Mahabharata or even before. It's my conviction that because our whole Asian history has been completely mismanaged. That is the reason I believe that that would have been an adaptation from the Vedic idea, the creation of the realm or not. I might be wrong also in this aspect. Now, as far as the getting inspiration from Islam is concerned, rather what has happened that they don't need inspiration from anyone. They are one of their own demons. They are one such demon that they can even go brutal than the Islamists for that matter, because they are good for none. Islamists do believe in the concept of brotherhood. Mao is the one who said that, if if an economy can be built over the skulls of the deads, even if they are Chinese, it's okay, because I need to grow. My empire needs to grow. But on the contrast, Islamists do have this whole idea of brotherhood, ummah, and let's embrace all together. So they are contradictory from Islam in this way, that they are even more dangerous. And if they at all now, what has happened, that why the radical Islam has become more terrific is of the spread. The spread what it has, because no one calls out religion as a evil. It's a religion, okay, it's spreading and things like that. But when it comes to the idea of a cult like communism for that matter, or the red communism or the red terror, of what we often say, so it has been recognized as terror, but it is getting very tough for people to really say that that religion itself is a terror. It becomes very tough to put it across that way. So that kind of contrasting line makes these people even more dangerous. And if they spread, and it can be disastrous. And as you rightly said, that they need to be stopped, because otherwise they will go on to keep on ravishing. Right now they talk about the five fingers. That day won't be far when they will start talking about including whole. You never know. They're crazy people who create the virus to kill own people just for some larger expansionist idea. They are so vicious. And so that's how I feel that they are a step above the radical Islamists, even more dangerous than them. And yes, as far as expansionism is concerned, they take idea from Islam too. They will take idea of expansionism from anywhere where it's possible, but they already have a doctrine that speaks about expansionism largely, much better than the Islamic doctrine per se. because Islam will talk about the brotherhood. They will not talk about brotherhood, but only expansion. Even if the whole world dies off, but the king should be there. So that is the idea of their expansionism, or that realm's concept. And as far as the first point is concerned about the expansion, so if we largely look at, because you wanted to put history in perspective, so I will also take history in perspective. What happened is that in the Asia, the only imperialistic country which existed with a larger extent or larger ambition was always China. Japan was also there, but they pacified with the time. They were not that active. Korea also tried. Every country tried to expand, because, as you rightly said, there's a phase. But India was not a land which was inevitably just like we started spreading culturally, like we talk about the Cholas also, but it was not about the annexation, but it was something very different what Cholas also did. So India has set a very right example that how you can spread through the culture, through the tradition. On the contrast, China has always picked the weapon to spread themselves. China and India were the two largest superpowers of Asia for a very long time. And even GDP share also speaks of that, because our GDP share actually went below China for the first time when Akbar the Great was the ruler in 1600 AD, where when our GDP shrunk for the first time. It was the last difference from China. Otherwise, still before the Islamic invasions, our GDP share was even larger than China, and there is no other country compatible, or it's only China or India. So and as far as the Romans are concerned, or the European powers with their expansion are concerned, so what happened is that once the mainstream politics came into place, or how when I say mainstream, I mean to say that when whole the concept of nation states began for them, then this whole imperialistic idea started getting truffled when all these associations like League of Nations were formed, United Nations came into play. Things changed for them. But this China again goes back to their, because they still are not able to, they will not put you even the right map, political map in place. They will take a map which is 100-year old. So it doesn't matter who is UN, who is WHO, for them it's all their own intent. So the only country which is continuing to expand right now is China. Russia also stopped after being, and their expansionism was very different, because their communism was about internationalism, and that's why they collapsed. Because, and this Chinese guys picked the ethnicity as the core, that let's go back to your books, and they fooled them so bad that they're spreading communism heart and out the way the Mao wanted. Mao modified it. And so that somehow makes me believe and feel and come to an inference that China perhaps has been the most dangerous of all the expansionists.
There are a couple of more questions coming to me on chat. So one by Alok Tripathi. What is the role of Japan in the present and past in checking Chinese expansionism?
Japan has
it likely to be in the future. That may be more.
See, Japan. One incident was very remarkable in whole of a world history, whether someone likes it or not. When the I forgot the name of the bombs, but when the two atom bombs were dropped, the whole things changed for Japan and whole of the Asia and whole of the world. Japan had got its what you can say that they got a complete check on the idea of expansionism. Their whole idea of imperialism was completely lost, because the devastation which came upon them, it was such a shock. It had brought such a shudder that it took so much time for them to recover. Still, Hiroshima, Nagasaki is worst of the shape. So I don't want to say that Japan earlier was a country as a bad or something as such, because as Sir also, the one who asked me question earlier, he also said that every country was looking for the expansion, but they were trying to put a lot of check on the China too. And China and Japan, there was a whole episode of China-Japan Wars too, where again it was all about because China wanted to expand, they too wanted to expand. They both were expansionist, and for that reason they had issues in terms of Taiwan. And in the current scenario, Japan is going to play a very crucial role, because Japan is another country with a lot of soft power, It also has got a lot of hard power. So they in collaborate. So it's important that the neighboring countries are strong enough to butt a country or a naughty country like China, which keeps on popping with, because you don't know that while we are talking, they might come up with just another virus. So they are such a naughty country that way. So to keep a check on them, we need a very powerful neighbors. We can't rely upon US. We need to be Atmanirbhar. That's a true reality, that we need to be very much self-dependent. And Japan happens to become a very true ally of India through the cultural bond, whether it's through the Buddhism or whether it's through even before Buddhism. Also, we had connect with the China. So now we are starting to trace those links. The two countries, the diplomats of the country are talking about those kind of ancient links and the chains which binds the countries together. And for the better future, I see that Japan and India will work together to bring down all the malicious acts of China.
There is another one from Dhruv Thakkar. He says, hello Abhasji, can you give some brief information regarding who are the allies of China in India?
So see, this is maybe Rahul, we should sometime also do a talk on all this subject itself, because people should definitely know, starting from Dange to Gangadhar Adhikari and whatnot.
I will start it right away.
So yeah, we have a lot of there are people will maybe that because of the hotness of the news and how it's spreading, people will initially talk about Congress playing as an ally to China, because in 2008, whatever MOU that Mr. Rahul Gandhi signed, in what capacity, he had no capacity to do so, but he signed. That's okay. But that reflects of that somehow they are definitely the ally. They are working as an ally, and also, but in the true sense, the communists have always worked as an ally to China. And like, if I start setting the perspective right, that how it all happened, that the split in the CPI also happened because of one wanted to align with the China and one wanted to align with the Russia. So we always, but no one wanted to align with India for that matter that time also. And during the 1962 war, there was a whole I forgot the name of that communist politician. He wanted to organize a blood donation camp for the Indian soldiers. So there were severe actions against him, and Jyoti Basu was instrumental. So, and during that time, a lot of radio stations were established where the whole news of what is happening for the war was reaching to, so that the information of India was passed on to China much more easily. Our CPI had tried to form a whole internal system in Indian Army itself, which would report to China. Even they were trying to get into Indian Army, and they have been very close ally of China from very long. And for me, right now, I can surely pick on the communists. Maybe some, at least I can see that the Gandhi Parivar is also aligning with China right now, which is not a right thing to do, because they come from a family which had history of fighting for Indian independence, whatever, maybe. But this is a kind of a blot, and so it is. There's a lot to speak about it, but I don't think that I should put a lot of things on it right now.
One more question. I mean, I don't know if you want to take it, but if ISIS can be banned, really, why not communism? So,
see, this is again a very communism. It's again now it gets very academic subject, and I like to speak on communism a lot. And you can't ban communism directly that way, because communism comes as an idea. It's just you can ban Communist Party of India, but not the communism. Like if I quote Ambedkar or paraphrase Ambedkar, Ambedkar didn't wanted to put the word like sovereign and secular in the constitution. When KT Shah asked him that why you don't want to, he wanted this to be added. Then he said that a constitution cannot govern how a state should behave, or the people of state should behave. It cannot be imposed upon anyone. So say for that matter, that if someone wants to just look for an idea that what communism is about, or wants to practice it also in his daily life, as long as he's not becoming a Maoist or someone as horrible as the communist of the day. So it doesn't affect largely. And communism also relates itself with socialism. And to some extent, again, it gets back to definitions that how you dig it out. But somehow all of us are socialist by our heart, that you are just passing by, you just stop by the signal and you see that someone where you might, just purchase a food for him. So that socialist angle will somehow not die out of any Indian. It will always be remaining. The way the Krishna had taken up his whole time during the childhood, he used to play with the people from various castes, various creeds. The whole idea of socialism existed within us. So it will not be so right to drench away communism as an idea, ban it, because you can't ban an idea. But the parties which are involved in the Naxal activities, which most of them are, most of the communists are the radical communist, or and if I have to put the definition of communism in a right perspective, I would say it this way, that communism can be defined the crux that there are two students. One student have had only read whole of a year and didn't write well in the exam. The other guy have worked so hard, but despite that, both of them are supposed to get the same marks, because the communism asks you to give the same reward, the same equal distribution of wealth irrespective of what you do. So that becomes such a European criminal state which cannot exist even in itself. Because even communists will themselves start agitating against it. So this idea itself is so confused that if worked in a very idealistic state the way they want to do, they will seize off at their own. You did not ban such ideas. Few ideas are born to be destroyed, and they themselves are their destroyer.
The lecture was very nice, sir. But I think this expansion is also going on in a kind of like a soft power way. Like even before this Galwan incident, previously, like all the left wing are giving example of like secularism in terms of look at China, or in the terms of communism. But actually, in reality, the how they treat the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province, they are not going to speak against it. It's like, but now what had happened after this Galwan attack is like the anti-Modi sentiments have become like anti-India sentiments, and the medias which are supportive of the left wing are posting articles or making videos in the favor of the China, like how they had in the ancient times had gone and acquired this land, and after like British era, how this place was actually in a mess, and then India actually went there, and then like after that that clash happened, and then this place actually belonged to the China, and they are reclaiming it. Like that propaganda has been showing up, and this type is not like actually the physical one, but actually the soft power which is being made from the left wing. This is what I think. I want you.
You are absolutely right. See, it's all about the soft power, and it's not going to be about the muscle power anymore. And that's why, China, I don't know if you know that how much China invested on buying the journalists. They paid a hefty money in 2017 to buy journalists, and this is on record. And so a lot of money had come to a lot of famous journalists whose names were also put out. So they are very clear with their strategy, what they want to do. They understand the worth of the economic. Like I said earlier, that expansion does not only mean that you just go and annex it, or you just go through the muscle power. Expansion means how much you can control, how much you can control the land, and to control the thing, the propaganda machine is very strong. And after the Nazis, or rather, let me put it this way, National Socialists, Nazis themselves never called themselves Nazis, right? They always were nationalist socialists. So, so last only nationalist socialists use this whole propaganda so well, no one else. So they spend a lot of money in buying the journalist, producing the news they want to. They also spend a lot of effort in spreading it into the right channels. Like, when for the first time, I had written in the month of February itself that how WHO is involved in all these things. Then I was trolled badly by the Chinese Twitter handles. Interesting point is that China doesn't have Twitter. Then who is tweeting on their end? How the Twitter is working there? So this sets a perspective very right that how strongly they work on to spread the propaganda. Now, as far as the so-called left, I call them so-called left because by the definitions they are not left at all. And that again is a very different debate because left was supposed to support the democracy and the right was supposed to go against the monarchy when it happened in France. That is where the whole concept of left and right come. So they don't support democracy; they support anarchy. So they are like Antifa also can't be. So, anyways, so what left is saying about that it's a Chinese land? They go against their own thesis. Now the whole communism is China controlled. There was a time when communism was Russia controlled. That was the time of internationalism when communism was speaking about. It was about no border concept. So now they will conveniently choose the concept of no border system and expansion per their own comfort. If India will go on to say that I want POJK back, then they will say that this is not fair. Who border doesn't matter. It's just a border is just a line. They will go into this whole postmodernist construct. The moment it will come to China, they will talk the other way around because they have had history of changing their track all the time. When in 1942, Stalin decided to now ally with the British instead of Hitler, Communist Party came on in support of the Britishers in India. Earlier, they were against the Britishers because their daddy Stalin was supporting Hitler. It happened even during the 1962 war. The whole bloc was just divided into pro-Russia, pro-China. No, there was very less pro-India that time also. So they will pick anything without the substance. So they themselves contradict each other. By the idea of communism, if I have to pick the idea from the book of the Karl Marx, then that kind of expansionism, what China is doing, doesn't work. And our communists are also not supposed to support it. But they take the orders from Peking or the Beijing. They don't take any more draw inspiration from what Marx had written because that is irrelevant. It's all ultimately about the power. Everyone, there would be very lesser of a true communist who will live life with a very limited resources. All of the communists would be tweeting from some iPhone. So they are full of hypocrisy in themselves, and the world has known that how they do the propaganda. Now, even if they are talking about forget about what media says, that I was very happy when Mr. Narendra Modi went on to do the Bhumi Pujan because it was a great example set. The media of the so-called left media, what we say, control media, BBC and Washington Post, everyone had vilified the judgment given by the Honorable Apex Court. But it was said that it's a criminal act and now the condition of the minorities will deteriorate. India is becoming another Nazi land or a National Socialist land rather. But what Mr. Narendra Modi did, the moment he went on to do the Bhumi Pujan, he said that, yes, you are calling it illegal, but I as a, the person representing whole of a land, I am saying that what you are telling is illegal is legal for me and I will go there and do the Bhumi Puja. He in the capacity of the Prime Minister did it. So that set a great precedent and a great example. Now, these kind of soft power misappropriation or the things what happens to the side of China needs to be taken this way by a very strong symbolism. When PM Modi spoke that day that the era of expansionism is gone. So though people will say that he didn't take the name of China, but that was a big symbolism. So irrespective, so there is a time is coming when even these media portals will become nullified. You guys need to work forward for it, collect the data, collect the information, put it across to them, write articles. Let's develop more of the soft power. It's more about, the time of grieving is gone. Now we have to just get into action. Like if someone called Ashok Sohan picks up some data from some 2015 to say that Swachh Bharat mission is a failure, you need to right away go to the World Bank data and say that, boss, what you are saying is wrong. So we need to become very proactive because they are known for propaganda. We have to bring the facts. So that is it. I think it kind of answers what you asked.